In 1828, a 19-year-old rural worker arrived in New Orleans for the first time. It was a city unlike any he had ever seen, with impressive buildings and large ships docked along the shore. But one scene would stay with him forever. He witnessed human beings being bought and sold at the market, treated no differently than commodities. Chains bound the helpless individuals as they were forced onto ships or off of them. The cruelty was so blatant that auction times and the exact number of slaves for sale, men, women, and children, were openly advertised. The ads specifically demanded cash payment. Credit was not allowed. The stark irony was that all of these individuals were black, bought and sold by white Americans. This young man didn't like what he saw, but felt powerless to act, being just a lowly boat worker himself. However, he told his friend that if he ever had the chance, he would put an end to this horrific business. At just 18, this young man had such a bold vision, but he knew he would need to become the most powerful person in the world to realize it. And against all odds, he did. But how did he achieve it? This is the story of Abraham Lincoln. I'm Faisal Warich, and you're watching the first episode of DSJ's mini-series, Who Was Abraham Lincoln? Let's begin with the beautiful small town of New Salem, located along the Sangamon River. It was here that Abraham Lincoln spent the first 6 years of his youth and faced some of his greatest failures. Lincoln's life was anything but easy. His mother died when he was just 9 years old, and his father remarried shortly after. While Lincoln wasn't dissatisfied with his stepmother, his relationship with his father was strained. His father often mocked and beat him. Despite the hardships, Lincoln learned to read and write and memorize parts of the Bible and Shakespeare's works, but he struggled with math. Lincoln was also physically awkward, with a face full of unpleasant scars and an awkward accent. His only remarkable feature was his height. He stood 6 feet, 4 inches tall, which helped make him more attractive. His ability to speak and engage people also became a valuable asset. In New Salem, Lincoln began his career as a storekeeper in a modest shop, selling basic goods like candles, wine, and utensils. Unfortunately, he was soon fired when the store owner went out of business. This marked his first failure. Lincoln spent his first 9 months in New Salem experiencing little success, but he earned the nickname Honest Abe after he returned a woman's overcharged goods to her home. Though his store failed, Lincoln's reputation as an honest man grew, and he decided to run for office in 1832. Confident that the people of New Salem and surrounding areas would support him, he was devastated when he lost the election. This was his second failure. At just 23, Lincoln was broke, with no food or money. He worked as a rail splitter and took up various other jobs, including as a postman and surveyor, but these still didn't provide the satisfaction he craved. He even challenged a local wrestling champion to a match, but lost. Historians suggest that he may have lost on purpose to gain the champion's sympathy and make new friends who later supported his political career. In 1834, Lincoln found a partner in William Berry, and together they opened the Berry-Lincoln store. Unfortunately, in 1835, Berry died, and the store was shut down, leaving Lincoln with a debt of $1,800. Lincoln eventually repaid the debt over 15 years, calling it his national debt in jest. During this period, Lincoln also suffered personal heartbreak. He fell in love with Anne Rutledge, a beautiful young woman in New Salem, but she was already promised to another. Tragically, Anne died of typhoid fever, and Lincoln was deeply affected. He often visited her grave, still mourning her loss years later. After these personal and financial setbacks, Lincoln left New Salem and moved to Springfield, where his fortunes slowly improved. He became a lawyer and eventually married Mary Todd, a wealthy woman, which helped stabilize his financial situation. However, despite his success, Lincoln's mind remained preoccupied with the memory of the enslaved people he had seen sold in the New Orleans market. At the time, the United States was divided over the issue of slavery. The southern states relied on slavery for agricultural labor, while the industrializing northern states were increasingly against it. Lincoln's views on slavery were not popular in his own party, the Whigs, or with his constituents, and he initially withdrew from politics to focus on his law practice. But as debates over slavery intensified, Lincoln was drawn back into the political arena. He took a stand against slavery in a series of speeches, which earned him the admiration of abolitionists. In 1858, he ran for Senate again, this time against his old rival, Stephen Douglas. The two men held 7 famous debates, where Lincoln eloquently argued that slavery should not be allowed in the United States. Despite losing the election, Lincoln's name gained national prominence as a symbol of opposition to slavery. Soon, the Whig Party dissolved, and the newly formed Republican Party offered Lincoln its nomination for president. His candidacy was supported because, unlike other candidates, no one had strong objections to him. In 1860, Lincoln was elected the 16th President of the United States, though his victory sparked the secession of Southern states that wished to maintain slavery. As Lincoln made his way to Washington, D.C. for his inauguration, there were threats against his life from those opposed to his presidency. Despite these dangers, he made it to the Capitol and soon faced the greatest challenge of his presidency, the American Civil War. The question of slavery would define his time in office, and Lincoln would have to confront the full weight of his promise to end it. But how did he navigate the treacherous waters of war, politics, and leadership? And how did he become one of the most revered figures in American history? We'll explore that in the next episode of Who Was Abraham Lincoln? Abraham Lincoln was born in 1809 on a small farm near Hodgenville, Kentucky. Due to the remoteness of his upbringing and lack of available public education, Lincoln was mostly self-educated. In 1836, after years of study, he qualified as a lawyer and went to work in a law practice in Springfield, Illinois. He sat in the Illinois State Legislature from 1834 to 1842, and in 1846 was elected to Congress representing the Whig Party for a 2-year term. In 1856, he joined the new Republican Party, and in 1858, he ran as their candidate for the U.S. Senate. Though he lost the election, his series of debates with Stephen A. Douglas thrust him into the national spotlight, and in 1860, he was nominated as the Republican candidate for president. In the presidential campaign, Lincoln made his opposition to the expansion of slavery very clear. His victory provoked a crisis for the Southern states, with many fearing that he would attempt to abolish slavery. 7 Southern states left the Union to form the Confederate States of America before Lincoln's inauguration. After the bombardment and surrender of Fort Sumter in April 1861, Lincoln called for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and 4 more states joined the Confederacy. Lincoln vowed to preserve the Union even if it meant war. The first year of war was not promising for the Union, and with their defeat in 1862 at the Second Battle of Manassas, Bull Run, it seemed like the second year of war would not be much better. Riding momentum from this victory, Lee and the Confederates staged an offensive with the Maryland campaign. However, the Union victory at the bloody Battle of Antietam pushed the Confederates back across the Potomac and provided Lincoln with an opportunity he had been waiting for to announce his plans regarding slavery. In the early months of the war, Lincoln maintained that the war was a struggle only to save the Union. After the Battle of Antietam, Lincoln announced the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. Officially on January 1, 1863, all enslaved people in the Confederate States of America were freed, signifying the Union's war aims had changed to include the abolition of slavery. In the effort to win the war, Lincoln assumed more power than any president before him, declaring martial law and suspending legal rights. He had difficulty finding effective generals to lead the Union armies until the appointment of Ulysses S. Grant as overall commander in 1864. By the beginning of his second term in March 1865, the war was clearly in its final days, and in his inaugural address, Lincoln summed up the policy he would follow in rebuilding the Union. With malice towards none, with charity for all. Soon thereafter, on April 9th, Confederate General Robert E. Lee surrendered the Confederate armies in Virginia, effectively ending the Civil War. Less than a week later, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by John Wilkes Booth, a pro-Confederate sympathizer, while attending a performance at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C., and died the next morning, April 15, 1865. Abraham Lincoln became the United States' 16th president in 1861, issuing the Emancipation Proclamation that declared forever free those slaves within the Confederacy in 1863.